Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Welcome to the Mad in America podcast. My name is Brooke Siem, and I am the author of May Cause Side Effects. Today, I am with Professor David Taylor and Mark Horowitz, co-authors of the Maudsley Deprescribing Guidelines. David Taylor is the Director of Pharmacy and Pathology at the Maudsley Hospital and Professor of Psychopharmacology at King's College in London. He is also the Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Therapeutic Advances in Psychopharmacology. He is a member of the United Kingdom's Department of Transport expert panel that introduced drug driving regulations. He's also currently a member of the UK government's Advisory Council on Misuse of Drugs, as well as the only pharmacist to have been made an honorary fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. David is also the lead author of the Maudsley Prescribing Guidelines and has been since their inception in 1993. The Maudsley Prescribing Guidelines have sold over 300,000 copies in 14 editions and 12 languages. He is also the author of 450 clinical papers in journals such as The Lancet, BMJ, British Journal of Psychiatry, and Journal of Clinical Psychiatry. His papers have been cited over 25,000 times. Mark Horowitz is a clinical research fellow in psychiatry in the National Health Service in London, visiting lecturer in psychopharmacology at King's College London, and honorary clinical research fellow at University College London and a trainee psychiatrist. He has a PhD from the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience at King's College London in the Neurobiology of Depression and Antidepressant Action. He is the lead author of the Maudsley Deprescribing Guidelines and is an associate editor of the Journal of Therapeutic Advances in Psychopharmacology. Mark co-authored the recent Royal College of Psychiatry's guidance on stopping antidepressants, and his work informed the recent NICE guidelines on safe tapering of psychiatric medications, including antidepressants, benzodiazepines, and Z drugs. He has worked with the NHS to develop national guidance for safe deprescribing for clinicians and has been commissioned by Health Education England to prepare a teaching module on how to safely stop antidepressants. Mark has written several papers about safe approaches to tapering psychiatric medications, including publications in The Lancet Psychiatry, JAMA Psychiatry and Schizophrenia Bulletin, and he has an interest in rational psychopharmacology and deprescribing a psychiatric medication. He has personally experienced the difficulty of coming off psychiatric medications, which has informed much of his work. David and Mark, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Okay, here's my first question. Who's Maudsley? What is Maudsley?
Yeah, it's a who. Henry Maudsley was a psychiatrist in the Victorian era, I believe, and the Maudsley Hospital was founded, I think, on the basis of a need for treatment of shell shock after the First World War. And it's arguably Europe's leading institute, I should say, for psychiatry research. Some might argue it's the world's leading institute. But it's famous for a variety of things, mainly the research that comes from it, but also some of the books that are published by people who work there or who have worked there. And one of those books is the Maudsley Prescribing Guidelines, of which there are several variations, and one of them we're talking about today, which is the Deprescribing Guidelines.
Right, and David, you have a big hand in the Maudsley Prescribing Guidelines over the years, correct?
When I first started the Maudsley in 1993, there was a guy there called Rob Kerwin, Professor of Psychopharmacology, and he had the idea of producing an evidence-based prescribing guide for mental health practitioners. And we produced something in 1994, which we were very proud of, which I still have one copy of. It's 14 pages long. It's got almost nothing in it, but it was a start. And we just used to run copies off on a photocopier in the 90s until somebody offered to publish it. I think that was the 5th edition. And then more recently, it's become important way outside the confines of the United Kingdom. most English-speaking countries use it as a guide to prescribing psychiatry. And also those countries where English is a widely spoken second language, like Holland and Germany and Sweden and so on and so forth.
David's a bit too shy to say it's really the most widely used psychiatric prescribing book in Europe, in the UK, and in Australia. Every psychiatrist I know in their brown leather satchel will have a copy of the Maudsley. And if they ever say, hold on a moment, I'll just tell you what drug I think I'll give you, they're running to the bathroom to open up the Maudsley Guidelines to quickly check one of the tables. So it's a very widely used book. I certainly used it when I was working in hospitals.
What's so interesting about it is that the prescribing guidelines came out starting in the early 90s, and yet here we are 30 plus years later, and now we finally have a de-prescribing guidelines, and the amount of change that's occurred in the world of psychiatry and medicating during that time is astronomical. And so what I would love to hear from both of you is how did you guys get to the point where you decided to take on this massive book, which is really quite heavy? I'm going to estimate about 7 pounds. And that is no small feat. And so I imagine there had to be a big personal as well as professional push behind that. Can you both tell me a little bit about what brought you to write this book and why it's important to you? Let's start with you, Mark.
Sure. So I'll say the weight of that might be 7 pounds, but it's the weight of about 300 weekends and about 600 evenings. It's 3 years of my social life out the window. How did it start? Well, I'm from Australia originally. I moved to London to do a PhD at the Institute of Psychiatry in sort of 2011. I did a PhD in how the neurobiology of depression and how antidepressants work. And at the end of that PhD, I read a paper that I found very shocking to me. It was about withdrawal effects from antidepressants. And at that point, I'd been on an antidepressant for about 13 years. I started it as a miserable third-year medical student, and I continued it for more than a decade. When I read that, and I hadn't heard about withdrawal effects from antidepressants before, I found it a bit startling because I sort of thought drugs that cause withdrawal also cause tolerance, and that means they wear off over time. So could something be working after more than 10 years on it? And also drugs that cause withdrawal tend to have a variety of negative effects. I thought about benzodiazepines, which are not widely used in the UK or Australia because of their toxic effects. But I thought, well, what would this drug be doing after 10 years and might it have negative effects? And I thought that I'll try to come off it because I had a lot of symptoms. I had fatigue and I had a lot of impaired concentration and memory, which I had started to wonder if that was to do with the antidepressants themselves, which had quite a big effect on my life. In retrospect, I think it had led me to get diagnoses like chronic fatigue syndrome and narcolepsy along the way. And so I decided to try to come off my antidepressant, and I went and read all the papers written by all the top academics in my field, some of whom I worked with at my institute, and they all universally said the same thing: antidepressant withdrawal effects, which they call discontinuation effects, a kind of industry term, mild and brief, and you can stop in a few weeks and there's no major issue with it. And that was fairly reassuring. And then because I'm a millennial, albeit a geriatric millennial, I went online to check what do people say. And it was quite a different story. They said it was really hard to come off. Some people got incredibly unwell coming off. It took them months and years. And I sort of didn't really know who to believe because I'm a fairly institutionalized person. I've got 6 academic degrees. I'm used to listening to professors. So I sort of split the difference and decided to come off over 4 months. And I halved my dose 4 times. And I used the equipment in my molecular biology lab at my university to get a liquid and go down by half every month, half, then a quarter, then an eighth, then a 16th. And I thought I was being pretty damn careful. And when I got down to, I was on Lexapro or escitalopram. I think I started at 10 and I ended up at 1 milligram. At 1 milligram, basically the floor fell out of my life. I started having trouble sleeping. I would wake up in the mornings, I think I said in full-blown terror, like I was being chased by a wild animal. And I would have this sort of sense of terror that would go throughout the day for hours and hours and hours. And I took up running, although I'm a bit of a couch potato, and I ran basically until my feet bled because it gave me a bit of relief from it. I felt a bit dizzy. Things around me felt a bit dreamlike. And it went on for week after week. And eventually I thought, I can't keep going on like this. And I ended up slowly going back on the medication. I ended up back on 10. I think I even went to 20 milligrams, the highest dose you could go on. And over a few weeks, things settled down. And it was really the scariest experience of my life. And it was nothing like the issues that put me on the drug in the first place. I think I said before, if you ever watched a Woody Allen film, I'm a kind of neurotic character. I wasn't very happy with my university course, but I'd never had panic, terror, trouble sleeping. If what I had when I came off the drug was 10 out of 10, what I'd had beforehand was 3 out of 10 before I started the drug. So, I found that a very alarming experience. I basically, at that time, I was working actually at the National Psychosis Unit, and it happened that the pharmacist on the unit was away on maternity leave, and she was filled in by her boss, which was Professor Taylor. And I talked to a few different academics about the trouble I had coming off, and I discovered this paper that showed that very small doses of medication can have very large effects, and that's why you might need to go down very carefully at the end, with the last couple of milligrams being the hardest to come off. And a lot of different psychiatrists have kind of laughed at me and said, these are homeopathic doses that you're talking about. How could you have had trouble? But when I went to talk to David, he instantly said, well, that's the law of mass action. That's because when there's not much drug about in the system, every milligram of drug has a very big effect. It makes a lot of sense. And I'd also found that he'd had troubles coming off his antidepressant, which he'd written about 20 years ago. So it was a bit of a coincidence in my mind that we sort of crossed paths and had similar experiences, and that he understood kind of some of the science that I was encountering. So I found a sympathetic ear in him, which was very encouraging to me. I ended up going back on the medication. Actually, I was so thrown by my experience, I moved back to Australia. I'd been living in London, and I moved back to Sydney to be close to my family. I was sort of ostensibly a grown adult, but it shook me so much that it finished my job, and I moved back. And I sort of didn't dare to try again for a couple of years. And then I tried again started in 2018. And at that point, I kind of understood that the people that I'd been studying under and the leaders in my field hadn't paid attention to this issue properly. They dismissed it, they'd minimized it, they hadn't really looked into it. And I had found that these online forums that I discovered, places like Surviving Antidepressants, actually had a lot more insightful advice on what was going on. I found lots of people that had similar problems coming off the drugs as me. And also they developed, really through trial and error, ways of coming off the drugs by reducing by about 10% of the dose every month. And, that matched the kind of these imaging studies that I had come across that showed why that probably made sense, because the last few milligrams are harder to come off. And so I basically started following what they recommended, coming off in this small amount. And I guess a couple of things came out of that. Number one, I found it much easier to come off my drug than doing it more quickly. Number two, a lot of the issues that I had for many years with fatigue and concentration and memory started to get better. So I've had a very big kind of improvement in my health. And so I thought, look, my colleagues need to know about these things. They seem not to be on their radar. And so I teamed up with David, and we wrote an article which we published in the Lancet Psychiatry, where I basically outlined what I'd learned on these websites and combined it with some of the academic work that had been done looking at the way that drugs affect the brain. That article got quite a bit of attention, and it led to, over the next few years, increased attention to the issue in England. The Royal College of Psychiatrists got us to write some guidance for them on how to stop antidepressants. The NICE guidelines, which are the government guidelines in England, adopted our approach in the way that they recommended people to come off their medications, although not with great detail. Different parts of the public health system have taken it up, so that I'm now working with the main pharmacy service in the country to put out this guidance to doctors and pharmacists. And I got more and more questions about it. I gave lectures to different groups of GPs and psychiatrists. One of the issues that kept on coming up is how do we implement this in practice? It all seems fairly complicated. There's some new guidance. What do we do in practice? And so now, a couple of years ago, David and I thought, well, we should write. There's all these guides on how to start medications and switch medications, of which, of course, the Maudsley Prescribing Guidelines is one. There's dozens of books around, but there really isn't a definitive, authoritative book for clinicians, for pharmacists, for GPs, for psychiatrists on how to do this, how to stop medications. And so we thought we'd write it, and optimistically, I thought, it'll take me 3 months. It'll just be a few pages. And because of my obsessive nature, it took 3 years and hundreds of pages. And so we basically put it together so that, kind of the learning that's happened over the last few years on what might be a safer way to come off these medications was sort of made available for clinicians in a kind of easy to digest way that they could put into practice in their clinics. And that's sort of how it came about.
Wonderful. David, what is the story from your perspective?
My journey it's not similar at all in a number of ways, but it ends up at the same place. I had been treated with a range of antidepressants in my 20s, and I hadn't had much success with them. I hadn't taken them for very long. They tended to be some of the older tricyclic drugs. Eventually, in my 30s, I went on venlafaxine. And once I was stabilized on that, if that's the right word, I noticed that I'd start to get withdrawal symptoms before my next dose was due. So I ended up taking it rather oddly once every 21 hours. And I had to do that in order to avoid the emergency withdrawal symptoms, which would come on just after 21 hours, like clockwork, so to speak. And I would start to feel a loss of sense of balance, dizziness, a slight anxiety, and all of those things would get worse were I not to take the next dose of venlafaxine. As it happens, venlafaxine didn't really help me, so I decided to stop taking it. I knew everything, in inverted commas, about stopping antidepressants, and I did it slowly, and I knew what the symptoms might be. What shocked me, though, was the severity of the symptoms. Even though I knew what was coming, and I knew the words to describe the things that I would experience, the experience of them was vastly different. So you can read flu-like symptoms, but you feel like you've got a pretty bad flu. That's not great on its own, but then you read about dizziness, anxiety, irritability, mood changes, sleep disturbance, color intensification, perception, vivid dreams. I had all of those, and all of them I'd read about, and all of them I thought you could put into mild or moderate, but actually altogether, that constellation, it was horrible, and it was horrible for several weeks. So then my next instructive experience, which I ignored at the time, to my regret, was that I got some funding for a helpline for patients in my department, and we'd have patients ring in about their medication. We'd have expert pharmacists answer them, and occasionally I would man the line. And what we found was that by far the most common reason for calling us was people trying to stop antidepressants. And we noted that there are a subgroup of people who said that they had very severe symptoms and that those symptoms lasted for months, if not years. And this is where my regret comes in, because when I spoke to people, when I heard about people who were claiming to have had very severe symptoms which lasted months or years, I kind of thought, now that's probably some kind of neurosis that's part of you that's behind that. I couldn't quite bring myself to believe that it was a drug-induced effect, or at least the stopping of a drug-induced effect. So I kind of stored that little observation away in my brain somewhere. And as time went by, the patient line closed down, and I heard more and more about people's experiences with severe and long-standing withdrawal reactions. And I came ultimately to be a believer, if I can put it that way. And although, of course, it's not a common reaction to stopping antidepressants, it's common enough for there to be a huge number of people who have these very severe and extended reactions to stopping antidepressants. So it was a happy coincidence that Mark and I spoke on the ward round. Mark's really the person to thank for where we are now, because Mark suggested to me that we write a paper about stopping antidepressants, and then he suggested that we submit it to the Lancet. And I kind of tried to put him off so as to manage his expectations, but he wasn't having any of it. And I thought, well, what harm could it do? Just to get a rejection a few days later. And we didn't get a rejection. As you know, it was accepted without really many changes, which is rare enough with any paper in any journal. So Mark had the self-confidence, I think, or maybe the grit and determination to submit it to a very high-ranking, highfalutin journal. And that the fact that it was published in that journal meant that it was read by a lot of people and that people took notice of it. And that was certainly the launch pad for us deciding later to put together a book. And you mentioned the weight of it right at the beginning. I never imagined it would weigh that much. And Mark will tell you at great length that actually we intended to get a book about stopping all psychotropics, but fairly soon realized that for the books to be a manageable size, we would have to break up the psychotropics into groups, which is why the first book is antidepressants, benzos, and Z drugs. There'll be other books to follow should Mark and I live that long.
The detail in here is unbelievable. You've got how many drugs are outlined in the book?
There's about 25 antidepressants. There's about 25 benzodiazepines and Z drugs, and then there's 2 gabapentinoids. It's about 55 drugs, I think, altogether. And I guess the reason why it's so long, and you're right, it is probably a bit complicated. I guess that's probably one basic message. It's harder to stop drugs than it is to start them. And I think the reason why it is so thick and absorbs so many of my weekends is because everyone's a bit different. I guess that's one of the issues that comes out in all the research and clinical experience here is some people have a fairly easy time coming off medication and some people have a very hard time. And there's probably a few factors that determine that, like how long you've been on the drug, which drug it is, your past experience. But that means there needs to be a lot of flexibility in how people come off. And so what takes up a lot of space in the textbook is different schedules for coming off for each drug that are either fast, moderate, or slow, so that there's a variety of different options for each person, and with advice on how to choose which one for which patient, how to adjust it based on how they respond to it, and all sorts of troubleshooting to make it a bit individualized. And because there's regimens for every drug, there's 55 different drugs with 3 regimens each, and that's why there's a couple of 100 pages taken up just by sort of step by step, this dose and then that dose, and also advice on, for that dose, you could use a tablet or half a tablet, and for these doses, you might need to use liquids or other versions. So that kind of goes through, to try to make it easy for any clinician or a patient who wanted to work with their doctor, how you would make up every single dose using available formulations. And we do it also for America, for Europe, for the UK, for Australia, and for Canada. So we're trying to cover large portions of the English-speaking world mostly, as well as Europe, on which drugs are available for each dose.
I want to talk about the law of mass action, because if there's any one if there's any one overarching theme here, it's that it's this hyperbolic curve, right? I mean, the fact that the word hyperbolic tapering is sort of weaseling its way into the average lexicon, I find to be pretty astounding because it's kind of complicated. So let's talk about the law of mass action and why it's important for psychiatric drug withdrawal, and also why we need clinicians to understand how this works.
Yeah, I think it's tempting for most people to imagine, without really thinking about it, that the relationship between the dose of a medication and its effect is linear. So, for example, you might think that to get 100% action from the drug, you might take the maximum dose. And to get 50% of that action, you might take half the maximum dose. But actually, it's nothing like that. The relationship isn't a straight line that runs from the bottom left to the top right. The graph that describes the relationship is more like the left-hand side of an arch. So if you think of that big arch thing in St. Louis, I don't know whether everybody would be familiar with that. I've actually had the pleasure of going up and round it. If you take the left-hand side of that, and think about it, it's quite steep when it's near the ground, and then it curves over at the top until it becomes horizontal. And that's the shape of the relationship between the dose along the bottom and the activity of the drug on the y-axis. So as you increase the dose from nothing to very little, you get a rather large pharmacological effect. And when you go from very little to a little bit more, that increases massively. When you get up towards the top of the arch, then as you increase the dose, the pharmacological effect hardly increases at all. So for many drugs, when you're on that flattened bit, you can double the dose, but the activity of the drug might increase from 98% of maximum to 99% of maximum.
So when I look at these charts, that seems to happen so much that steep drop off the cliff, it happens so much earlier than the strength of the drugs on the market, if that makes sense. And so is there a correlation to be made here, or a conclusion to be drawn that when we see people's doses going up and up and up, that it's not actually having any more effect? Like, does it work in the opposite direction as well?
Brooke, you put your finger on it. You know, that steep bit of the curve that David's explained, happens below the smallest available tablet for most medications. So the smallest dose for Effexor is 37.5, and for citalopram or Celexa, it's 10 or 20, and for Lexapro, it's 5 or 10. And, doctors and pharmacists in general think, well, it's a very low dose. What they mean by that is that it's the smallest tablet available. But in terms of effect on the brain, it's not that lower dose because of that steep curve. And so when people are told to, halve their tablet and then stop it, everyone thinks, well, that's a very small dose. They must be close to, the ground. They can just step off. But because of this, this steep curve, I often think about that as sort of walking out the 7th floor window. You think it's at the bottom, but actually you're still kind of high up on the building. And then when people fall out of the 7th floor window and end up in a huge, mess, the doctors conclude, well, you've come down to a very low dose. If you've had trouble, you must need the drug. If you're panicked and depressed, and they don't see that actually what's happened is they've come down from this quite high level. And that's why a proportion of people on long-term antidepressants will need medication other than commonly available tablets to get off the drug safely, whether that's a liquid version of the drug or compounded capsules or some other way of making up smaller doses. And I think that's a very, important take home of the book.
You guys kind of came to this conclusion through the PET scans that were done. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of a convergence of things. I mean, there was kind of an evening where I sort of spat my soup out, and that was because I was looking at these forums that were explaining to come down by 10% of your dose every month. And I thought that, I don't know why that makes sense. okay, it's small dose. It's going down in smaller amounts makes sense, but why would it get smaller and smaller? And then I came across this nuclear imaging that had given people different doses of medication and scanned their brains to see how big an effect it has on their receptors, which you can just think about as an effect on the brain. And it traced out the curve that David explained, this left-hand side of the arch, and it exactly matched what the patients had worked out by trial and error. Because by going down by 10% of the dose, you basically trace out that arch. And I thought, this is incredible. People, thousands of people around the world, have in their kitchens, kind of through trial and error, worked out a relationship that exactly matches, a neurobiological observation in imaging studies that matches the law of mass action. And so I thought, that makes a huge amount of sense. If small doses of drug have big effects on the brain, then you need to go down very carefully at the end. And so I guess it was the convergence between that imaging and people's experience that made me take it seriously. And I guess since then, there hasn't yet been a randomized controlled trial that's looked at it, but there's been a few observational studies, people who have tried what I would call the old-fashioned way of coming off their medications by halving it and then halving again and stopping it, and who'd found they couldn't come off in that way when they've been given a hyperbolic tapering approach using compounded medications called tapering strips, have mostly been able to stop their medications. So there's been a few studies now suggesting that this approach works better for people that have had trouble. And we're also in the middle of running a trial in Australia that is a randomized trial to look at this approach.
Let's say you've got a clinician in Iowa who's not really up to date on this stuff, but who hears about the book and grabs the book. Are there any precautions or limitations that we would hope that people new to this topic should be aware of when using the guidelines as part of their practice?
I think a core principle that Mark and I both adhere to is that the process should be patient-led rather than clinician-dictated. So it's the patient who's experiencing the withdrawal, and the tapering regimen should be tailored, adjusted to the patient's experience. And that works in both directions. So it should be slowed and be more hyperbolic in people who have severe and long-standing reactions. And it may be quicker and shorter in people who have very limited reactions. It's worth saying there are a group of people who seem to be able to stop antidepressants without many problems at all. And there seems little point in prolonging the withdrawal phase of the medication, notwithstanding the fact that it's probably true, although it's not entirely certain, that abruptly stopping antidepressants does make relapse more likely. The whole field is rather confused because of withdrawal reactions mimicking relapse. But what I'm trying to say is that there's a good reason to go slowly, even with people who don't have a severe reaction, because they'll probably benefit in the longer term. But the core tenet, I think, is that the process should be patient-led. Another thing to note, and this is probably more by accident than design, and that is the book is quite a good read. I mean, sometimes when you're involved in something like this, it's difficult to get any objectivity on it because you see it so often. But I had a period where I didn't read what we'd written, mainly what Mark had written. And then I came to it and it was like reading somebody else's stuff. And I thought, this is really quite interesting. And I was keen to turn the page and see what was coming next. So it's not by any means a turgid, tedious read. It's nicely constructed and engaging. I think, somebody who opens it up for a quick read will probably find themselves there reading it a bit longer than they expected.
I also noticed too, when I cracked it open and started reading it, I mean, you guys don't just get right into the pharmacological things. There's a pretty robust and important discussion about what withdrawal is, why we are where we are, what the kind of pitfalls have been so far. And it's a book I would recommend to the family members of somebody who's in withdrawal, because it could really help them understand in pretty plain language what we think is going on, which again is just hugely valuable given the amount of crap 900-word articles on the internet.
The reason why it ended up being so long is because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about a lot of this material, and I was, at pains to try to correct them. And so maybe one, I'll put my finger on one, is you said, what should doctors be aware of when they crack this book open? I think there's generally an increased understanding that there's withdrawal effects from antidepressants. I think people kind of know you can get dizzy and you're going to get a headache, and David pointed out it could be more severe than it sounds like in a textbook. I think people still don't quite get their heads around protracted antidepressant withdrawal. And David said that when he first heard that, it sounded to him like the product of a neurotic mind. And I got to say, I completely agree. If I had encountered this stuff in patients, I would have had David's exact reaction, that this sounds a bit nutty. I was taught antidepressants are kind of as safe as paracetamol or Advil, aspirin, and so to have people that were in bed for months with dizziness and they light hurt their eyes and they were having panic attacks, I would have thought, this sounds a bit funny. So, a lot of my colleagues still think that, and I have some sympathy for them because it sounds so out of left field. And if I hadn't had firsthand experience of some of those symptoms, I don't think I would have had enough insight into it to believe that. So I kind of understand, that skepticism from my colleagues. It doesn't fill me with pleasure, but I understand where it comes from. And I guess so part of the book was to try to explain some of this to make it a bit clearer to people. Let's pick up the delayed one first. That's, the textbooks say that withdrawal should come on within 3 to 4 half-lives of a drug because the drug has left your system. And the half-life of most antidepressants is about a day, so it should come on in a few days. And that often does happen. I started seeing people coming in a few weeks after stopping an antidepressant with withdrawal effects. Electric zaps, dizziness, headache, really classic withdrawal symptoms. And I at first thought, look, this can't be withdrawal. It can't come on weeks afterwards. And I saw several cases. I thought, it does sound very typical. There's a couple of things that make me believe that it is withdrawal. Number one, there's an imaging study that shows that the brain elimination time for antidepressants can actually be weeks. So although the half-life in the blood is a day for most antidepressants, it seems to leak out slower from the brain. I don't know if that means it's sticky in the central compartment, but it does make sense of why it might take some people weeks for withdrawal to come on. And then in another study, I found the time to onset, the average was 4 weeks in a group of patients. It was a selected group of people on these online forums, maybe not representative. And the standard deviation was 13 weeks. In other words, some people in this group experienced withdrawal effects that came on 4 months after stopping. So there clearly is more variation than textbooks had said, and that does cause people a lot of confusion in spotting it. So that's number one. And the second thing is protracted withdrawal syndromes. Stories like this: the patient comes in, they say, I've stopped my antidepressant, 3 months ago. When I stopped it, I developed terrible symptoms, panic attacks, terrible mood, and I'm still there 3 months later. And the doctor says, well, the drug is out of your system. It's been out for weeks. It couldn't be because of the drug. This cannot be withdrawal. That doesn't make any sense. You must have developed a new onset panic disorder, or maybe you've developed multiple sclerosis. We need to send you to a neurologist. And that's what happens. People get sent around to specialists, or they get told they've got a mental illness and they should take more medication. And I might have believed that as well, but I see now many, many people with those long-lasting symptoms. And the way it makes sense to me is the brain adapts to the drug when you're on it. So if you take a drug that increases serotonin, then your body will become less sensitive to serotonin. It adapts. That's because of homeostasis. When it's too hot outside, we sweat. When it's too cold outside, we shiver. If your brain is exposed to too much serotonin, it becomes less sensitive to serotonin. And you can see that in just a few weeks of being given an antidepressant on brain imaging. Now, when you stop the antidepressants, your serotonin levels go back to normal because it blocks one of the receptors, the blockage goes away. But your brain doesn't just snap back into how it was before the drug was there. Those adaptations, those changes take a while to get back to normal. And in fact, in one study, after stopping antidepressants in patients, there were changes in the serotonin system for up to 4 years after stopping. And in animal studies, they find similar findings, that there are changes to the hormonal system and the serotonin system that last for more than a year in human equivalent time after stopping antidepressants. And the analogy that comes to my mind is when you go to a loud concert, your eardrums become less sensitive to sound. And if you then walk out into a quiet street, people around you sound muffled for a few minutes. There's actually a sound withdrawal syndrome. Now, when you shut the door on the concert, the sound disappears in a second. What takes a few minutes to go back to normal is your eardrum readapting to normal levels of sound. And the same is true for exposure to psychiatric drugs. When you stop them, your liver and kidneys metabolizes them in a few days or weeks. They're out of your system. But what can last longer is the adaptations that your brain has made to the presence of those drugs that can last, we think, for months or years. And that is probably why withdrawal syndromes can last for so long, is because of the residual effects on the brain after stopping the drugs. And so that's why they can last for longer than the drug takes to leave the system. We haven't done very much research into what causes protracted withdrawal. It hasn't been seen as a legitimate condition for a long time. So there hasn't been brain imaging or the study of hormones or whatever is going on. So we don't know, but I think it's pretty clear that people's nervous systems are affected because they get neurological symptoms, they get psychological symptoms, they get bodily symptoms. So something is clearly going on, and we know that there are these changes that can stick around. We really need to look more into it, but I think doctors need to be aware that that is a possibility, and we think that that probably occurs more often if you come off too quickly. So it's a good reason to come off slowly, just to avoid the risk of that happening to you, because I've seen it. I've got an inbox full of people, unfortunately, with that condition, and it really upends their lives. It's absolutely can be devastating for some people.
How does the Maudsley Deprescribing Guidelines handle polypharmacy? What do we do when a patient's on 2 or more drugs, as again is the case of many people in my inbox?
Yeah, I think we skirt it to a large extent. It's covered more in the Maudsley Prescribing Guidelines, but even there, it isn't covered in any depth. The number of combinations that you can find people on in polypharmacy regimen is tending towards the infinite, and it's almost impossible to create, gather, report on any information on particular combinations, simply because there are so many different variations of those combinations. But certainly it's an important consideration, and it's something that's hardly been researched at all. How is withdrawal better or worse when you're taking an antidepressant with a benzo, or with a benzo and an antipsychotic, a partial agonist like aripiprazole? We simply don't know. And I mean, our book's big enough as it is. It would have been much bigger if we tried to include the polypharmacy angle. But it's that's not to say that the importance of polypharmacy should be underestimated.
Are there any loose guidelines that you guys have noticed clinically?
We put in a couple of broad principles. As Dave said, it's too complicated to go into every single one. We put in two broad principles. One was to either think about the drug that has the most harm compared to benefit, or to think about the drug that's easiest to come off. If someone has a very strong feeling, this drug really, makes me feel very tired, or really, puts on weight, that's the drug I want to stop, then the person's preference, should be primary. If they're not sure, you might look at a series of drugs and work out which might be having some benefit for them or no benefit, and which ones are causing the most harm. Or the other approach that I often take is, it's nice to be able to have a win. They want to come off medications. It's nice to choose something that's easy. And so you might choose a drug that's easiest to come off. And that's often the drug that's been started most recently. So if someone's been on a drug for 20 years, it's generally hard to come off. If someone's been on a drug for 2 months, it's generally easier to come off. And so it's sort of balancing patient's preference something about harms versus benefits, and also which one might be easiest. There's ideas out there about drugs that help you to sleep you should keep for the end. Drugs that tend to be stimulating you start at the beginning. I think those things are reasonable ideas to include as well. But it's often a bit of a discussion with people to see what they want and what objective ideas you can bring in.
I know, Mark, you especially have dealt with your fair share of pushback doing all the work you're doing. I'm wondering how the Maudsley Deprescribing Guidelines have been received so far amongst prescribers, and just what has your experience been with the actual publication of the book?
It's been, I think, as with all my work, it's been very mixed. Some people let's stick with clinicians. Some psychiatrists have written to me and said, I've been doing this a bit myself, and to have a guideline, has made my practice, much more streamlined. Thank you very much. I bought one for every nurse in my clinic. And although I think the response, David can correct me, I think of the kind of mainstream academic psychiatrists has mostly been to ignore it, I think. A lot of GPs, pharmacists, and nurses have written to me and said that they've bought it and that they use it they're trying to apply it in their clinics. There's lots of practical barriers. I've been invited to give a lot of talks to a lot of different groups of people because of it. So I've talked to a lot of GP groups, a lot of pharmacy groups in America, mostly in the UK, some in Australia. So there's been everything from great interest and excitement to cold shoulders, and then there's sort of a parallel aspect where a lot of patients have bought the book. In some ways, I feel that it's a little bit sad that the patients have to buy the book to give to their clinicians. I've heard people that have bought it for their GP. I've heard of one guy that bought it for every psychiatrist who worked, at his VA hospital. In some ways, I wish that doctors would have an interest in it, because obviously I think being a good doctor is knowing how to start medication, knowing when to stop it and how to stop it safely. I don't think it's, I think it's part of good quality practice. But anyway, patients have taken it up themselves to try to get clinicians on board. I'd be interested to hear what David's impression has been.
Yeah, I think mostly positive. I get people write to me, emailing me, thanking me. It's not often I get emails like that, thanking me for producing the information. Also, I keep an eye on the Amazon reviews. Most of those are very positive. Although Mark and I wrote the book for clinicians, it's interesting that almost all of the reviews on Amazon are from patients. I haven't had much in the way of negative feedback. Part of the reason for that may be that a lot of people in the field of psychiatry, have this kind of semi-delusion that I know what I'm talking about. So they might be wary of challenging me in my own field, so to speak. Although, I would be happy to be challenged on it. And I don't want people to run away with the idea that I'm anti-medication in psychiatry or anti-antidepressants. I'm not at all. I've taken lots of psychotropics, sometimes with considerable success. But I do think there needs to be a balance between the massive amount of promotion that there is funded by pharmaceutical companies to start these medications, and what limited information there is, and almost nothing before Mark and I produced this book, on how to stop the medication. And as Mark rightly points out, that's as important, if not more important, than how you start them.
Well, I personally think it's amazing that so many patients are taking it upon themselves to get this book, because for so long, so much medical research has been behind paywalls. Patients have only been able to get this information. Well, they've only been able to get any information from a prescriber. And I think that's part of the reason why we're in the pickle we're in. So I love that so many patients are just going to Amazon and buying the book for, I think it's $35 or something that I bought it for. It's, thankfully not one of these $150 academic books. So I actually see that as a huge win.
Yes, sorry, I was about to say I'm the resident pessimist, and then I realised that we're both pessimists here. We have written the book, for it to be, some parts of it are a bit academic, but it is written in a way that any informed member of the public could understand it. And we kind of foresaw that a patient, ideally working with a clinician, would be able to take, we'd be able to inform themselves about what's the best way to come off their medication, because I think more and more in the modern age, patients in general are taking their health into their own hands and informing themselves, and I think this could be, in part, we kept an eye out to keep the language open to being understood by the public. And so I think this could, generate conversations between patients and their clinicians about what would be the best way to come off medication. And I think that's borne out by patients bringing this into their doctors and clinicians to start those conversations.
All right. Well, to close, I would love to just let you guys dream a little bit. Where do you hope the research around withdrawal goes? Where do you hope we're going with all of this, and what can people do to just continue to spread the good word?
We produced a book which, for each drug, has 3 different ways of stopping the medication. I would like research to help us define regimens for withdrawal which enable people to stop antidepressants with as few problems as is physically possible. And that would make a huge difference to a huge number of people in the world. The use of antidepressants is astronomical. So there are millions of people taking them around the world, and those millions of people will ultimately have to stop taking them. And I would hope that research will tell us exactly how we can get people stopped with as few problems as possible.
Yeah, exactly. We to learn how to individualize it for a person. I mean, to first of all, I guess research, which is part of what we're doing in Australia, is to look at, does stopping in this hyperbolic way, improve over stopping in the old-fashioned way? A lot of studies suggest that it will, but it would be good to show it, because that will influence guidelines around the world, which like to see randomized controlled trials. And then the next step is exactly what David is saying, that to know for an individual who's on Zoloft for 10 years and, is 45 years old and they've come off twice in the past, what rate should they go at? So that it's individualized for people, so there's not all this trial and error. I mean, because at the moment there definitely is, an aspect of trial and error. You have to, as they say in the UK, suck it and see. Try it. If things are, too difficult, slow it down. It'd be great to take that away, that sort of uncertainty away from people. I'm very interested into knowing what's happening in people's brains on long-term medications that seems to be left residual after they stop. Are there ways to reverse it? Is it better to give people short-term medication to avoid some of those long-term consequences? Is there any intervention to help people that suffer these protracted withdrawal syndromes? And I think, a lot of the research that suggests people should use long-term medication, is flawed because withdrawal effects aren't taken into account. So you might be aware that a lot of the guidelines recommend long-term antidepressants and other drugs from studies in which they're stopped very quickly, and they find that people that stop them feel worse, and no one ever really looks at withdrawal effects. So it could be that actually the reason why people feel worse is because of withdrawal, in which case the drugs are not quite as effective at preventing relapse as people think. And so I think a lot of those studies need to be relooked at and withdrawal taken into account. So that might have quite a big influence on what the results of trials are.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Do you have any closing remarks or any asks of the audience?
I guess any clinicians who are listening, I would implore you to try stopping medications more slowly, especially at the end, and using things like liquids to make it easier for patients. It's very gratifying as a clinician to see people come off their drugs that they thought they couldn't stop, and I hope other clinicians out there get that experience.
Well, Mark and David, thank you so much for being with us today. Again, the book is the Maudsley Deprescribing Guidelines, and it can be found on Amazon. Thank you both. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. For more news, views, and updates, visit madinamerica.com.